The turkey was perfectly golden. I remember noticing that first, before anything else, before the envelope, before the world I had built over 11 years began to quietly disassemble itself. The turkey was golden, the candles were lit, the good china was out, and Diane had even ironed the linen napkins into precise triangles the way she always did when she wanted the evening to feel important. I remember thinking, this is a beautiful table. I'm Mara. I was 38 years old that December, and I had spent 11 of those years learning to read every signal in that house like a second language. Ashford Falls is the kind of Ohio city that looks charming in December, old brick storefronts strung with white lights, the smell of wood smoke drifting through the neighborhoods, the river half frozen and catching the low afternoon sun. Connor and I had bought our house 3 blocks from his parents' place 8 years earlier, which at the time had felt like a gift. Close enough for Sunday dinners. Close enough for Nolan to walk to his grandmother's after school. It wasn't until much later that I understood proximity and closeness are not the same thing at all. Connor was at the head of the table, carving, making the easy small talk he was always so good at. He had his father's broad shoulders and his mother's precision, that particular way of doing everything with just slightly too much control, as though the real self was always being managed. I had loved that about him once. The steadiness. 11 years together, 12 counting the year we dated before the wedding, and our son Nolan was 12 now, sitting across from me pulling apart a dinner roll with the focused disinterest of someone who has learned that adult dinners are something you survive. Diane sat at the opposite head of the table. She was 64, silver-haired, with the posture of a woman who had decided at some point in her 40s that the world would conform to her expectations and had simply never revised that decision. She ran the family's real estate holdings, 3 commercial properties in Ashford Falls, 2 rental units outside Columbus, with a quiet ferocity that everyone in the family called competence and that I had, privately, for years called something else. The envelope was sitting beside her water glass. I noticed it the way you notice something that doesn't belong, not with alarm, not yet, just with a small tick of attention. A standard legal-size envelope, white, unsealed. I told myself it was property paperwork. Diane was always moving documents around dinner tables. It was practically her love language. We ate. We talked. Connor told a story about a contractor who had mismeasured a commercial doorframe and Diane laughed at exactly the right moment, and Nolan asked if he could be excused before dessert, and I said no, and the candles burned down a half-inch, and outside the December dark pressed against the windows. Then Diane placed her hand flat on the envelope and slid it across the table toward me. Not toward Connor. Toward me. I think it's time we handled this cleanly, she said. Her voice was the same temperature it always was, room temperature, pleasant, final. Before the new year. I looked at Connor. He was cutting a piece of turkey he had already cut. He didn't look up. I opened the envelope. The words petition for dissolution of marriage appeared at the top of the first page in clean legal font, and the air went out of the room as completely as if someone had opened a window in January. 12 years. 11 married. Our son sitting 4 feet away, examining the pattern on the tablecloth. I turned to the signature page. The line read Connor James Halloran. The signature beneath it was precise, forward-leaning, with the looped C and the sharp crossing of the T that I had watched Connor write on checks and birthday cards and school permission slips for over a decade. Except it wasn't his handwriting. I knew his handwriting the way I knew his voice, the way I knew the sound of his footsteps on the stairs. And this wasn't it. I set the document down on the table beside my plate, and I looked at Diane, and I said nothing. Because something had shifted inside me, not panic, not grief, not the clean crack of betrayal I might have expected. Something quieter and stranger than all of that. Someone had forged my husband's name on divorce papers. And his mother had just handed them to me at Christmas dinner. Let me tell you what the 11 years before that dinner looked like from the inside, because you need to understand how a person can live inside something that's slowly wrong without ever quite finding the right angle to see it clearly. I had been an interior designer for 14 years, running a small firm out of a converted Victorian on Maple Street with 2 part-time employees and a client list that had taken me a decade to build. I was good at it, not in a flashy way, but in the way that gets you referrals, that gets you the Whitmore renovation and the Callahan Hotel lobby and the quiet, steady accumulation of work that pays school tuition and keeps the mortgage current and lets you feel like you're building something real. Connor worked in commercial property management, specifically in the maintenance and leasing operations of Diane's holdings. He had a title, Director of Operations, and a salary, and a private understanding with his mother that I had never been fully permitted to see the terms of. This had bothered me in a theoretical way for years. In a practical way, I had decided it was none of my business. This, I would later understand, was its own kind of choice, the kind that feels like restraint but is actually avoidance. Our marriage was, by the surface measurements that most people apply, functional. We were not cold. We argued sometimes, reconciled usually, moved through the weekly machinery of a shared life, school drop-offs and grocery runs and the particular exhaustion of 2 people managing careers and a child and a house in a mid-sized city where everything costs slightly more than it should. Connor could be distant. There were periods, weeks, sometimes a month, where I felt like I was talking to the outline of him rather than the person inside it. I attributed this to stress. To the way men and his family had learned to carry things quietly. I was very good at finding explanations. Diane had been part of our life in a way that was difficult to describe to people outside it, because it never announced itself as intrusion. She was simply present. Present at Nolan's school events, present when we were deciding on contractors for the kitchen renovation, present, once, memorably, at a client dinner of mine that she had simply appeared at after Connor mentioned it in passing. She was helpful in the way a current is helpful to a swimmer who doesn't realize they're being carried somewhere they didn't choose to go. The first thing I missed was in year 3 of our marriage. Connor's father, Gerald, died of a sudden cardiac event in March, and the family spent 6 weeks in legal and financial reorganization. The 3 commercial properties transferred to Diane's name. Connor received a structured inheritance. I was told it was a combination of property equity and a trust instrument, but I never saw the documents. Connor said it was handled. Diane said it was handled. I believed them both, because they said it with the same flat certainty, and I was 6 months pregnant with Nolan and I didn't have the capacity to push. Looking back now, that was the first point of no return. Not a dramatic one, no raised voices, no obvious betrayal. Just a door that closed and stayed closed, and me deciding it didn't need to be opened. I had built my entire understanding of our financial life on a foundation I had never actually examined. The second thing I missed was Jessie. Jessie had been my closest friend since graduate school, an architect from Columbus who had moved to Ashford Falls the same year Connor and I got married. She and Diane had met at one of our dinner parties in year 4 and had, over the following years, developed their own easy familiarity. Coffee. The occasional lunch. I thought nothing of it. Jessie was sociable that way, good at moving between worlds. I was proud, in a slightly self-congratulatory way, that the people I loved had found their own connection. I didn't think to ask what they talked about. That autumn before Christmas, there had been a shift I couldn't locate precisely. Connor was absent in a new way, not the old stressed quiet, but something that felt more deliberate. He was on his phone in the other room. He left the dinner table before Nolan finished eating. He stopped asking about my work in the casual, habitual way he always had, the how did the Callahan meeting go questions that weren't really questions so much as the ordinary maintenance of 2 lives interlocked. When they stopped, I noticed the silence they left. I told Jessie about it over coffee on a Wednesday in November, in the same cafe on 3rd Street where we had been having coffee for 9 years. She had nodded and held her cup with both hands and said, carefully, Connor's been under a lot of pressure lately. Diane mentioned that commercial leases are being renegotiated. I had accepted this. It was plausible. It was offered, gently, specifically, and I was so practiced at accepting offered explanations that I didn't register the strange weight of the word mentioned. Jessie had heard about Connor's stress from Diane. Not from me. January is when I should have started asking questions. I started asking them in late November, which meant I was 6 weeks behind the version of this story where I catch it cleanly. It started with a bill. I handled our household accounts, always had. It was a division of labor we'd settled into without discussion, and in late November I noticed a charge I didn't recognize. Not large. $412 to a legal services firm called Merritt and Associates in Columbus. I looked them up. They were a family law practice. I asked Connor about it over dinner, casually, the way I always tried to ask things I wasn't sure I was allowed to ask. He said it was a billing redirect, some corporate legal work of Diane's that had been mistakenly routed to our account. He would fix it. His voice was level, his eyes were on his plate, and the explanation was reasonable in the way that things are reasonable when someone has had time to prepare them. I didn't mention it again. But I started paying closer attention. Over the next 3 weeks I found 4 more small charges to accounts I didn't recognize, 2 to a Columbus accounting firm, 1 to what appeared to be a document courier service, 1 I couldn't identify at all. None were large enough individually to require a conversation. Together, they were a pattern. A pattern I didn't let myself name yet, because naming it would require doing something about it, and I wasn't ready for what doing something might cost. I started noticing other things. Connor's laptop, which had always lived open on the kitchen counter, a habit I had once found mildly annoying, the domestic sprawl of it, was now consistently closed, and occasionally password protected when I reached for it to look up a recipe and found the screen dark and locked. He had always kept a yellow legal pad on his office desk where he drafted notes, the kind of analog habit that felt endearingly old-fashioned. The legal pad disappeared in mid-November. I found it once, briefly, on the kitchen table, and the top page had been torn off. Nolan noticed too, in the way children notice things, sideways, without naming them. One evening in late November he came into the kitchen while I was making dinner and said, with the studied casualness that 12-year-olds use when they're actually quite frightened, "Is Dad moving out?" I turned around. "What makes you ask that?" He was looking at apartments online. I saw the screen. He set it to his shoes. On the tablet. I held very still. He's probably looking for tenants. For Grandma's properties. Nolan looked at me for a moment with an expression I will never entirely stop seeing. Not accusation. Not even disbelief. Just the particular sadness of a child who has understood something an adult is still pretending not to know. "Okay," he said, and went to his room. That was the night something inside me finally, quietly, stopped pretending. I didn't tell Jessie about the apartment search. I had started to feel, without being able to explain why, that certain things should be kept from her. A small instinct I pushed down, told myself was paranoid, but kept nonetheless. What I did instead was call my own lawyer, not a family lawyer, not yet, just a general practice attorney named Richard who had handled a contract dispute for my firm 2 years earlier. I described the situation in careful, neutral terms. He told me that if I suspected financial reorganization was being done without my knowledge or consent during a marriage, I had the right to request full disclosure of shared assets, and that any significant financial decision made unilaterally by a spouse could constitute financial misconduct. I wrote down what he said. I folded the paper. I put it in the zipper pocket of my work bag, where Connor never looked. I didn't use it. Not yet. But I had it. Looking back now, I can identify the exact shape of what was happening in those weeks. I was gathering without acting, stockpiling without confronting, moving around the edges of a truth I already half knew as though I could somehow dismantle it by circling it slowly enough. I told myself I was being careful. What I was actually being was afraid, not of losing Connor, I think, but of confirming what I had already begun to suspect, that the betrayal wasn't only his. I found the folder on the 14th of December, 11 days before Christmas dinner. Connor had left for a site visit in Columbus, and overnight, something that had become more frequent that fall, and Nolan was at a friend's house, and I was in Connor's home office looking for the cable to the portable hard drive I needed for a client presentation. I wasn't snooping. And then I was. The folder was in the second drawer of his filing cabinet, not hidden exactly but filed under insurance, auto/home, which was the last place I would normally look. It was a cream-colored manila folder, thick, with a rubber band around it. I opened it standing at the desk, and then I sat down, because my legs didn't seem reliable. Inside were printed documents. Real estate transfer records, 3 of them, dated across the previous 8 months, each one reorganizing a portion of the Halloran family properties. 2 of the commercial buildings in Ashford Falls had been transferred to a new LLC. The LLC's name was a generic string of letters, HFG Holdings, with a registered agent address in Columbus. Connor was listed as a 10% stakeholder. Diane held 85%. The remaining 5% was held by a name I had to read twice before I understood it. Jessica Marie Elton. Jessie's legal name was Jessica Marie Elton. I sat at Connor's desk for a very long time. The air conditioner clicked on somewhere in the house, a sound so ordinary that it seemed almost offensive. I was aware of my own breathing. I was aware of the folder in my hands. I was aware that what I was holding meant that my best friend had been, for at minimum 8 months and possibly longer, a financial stakeholder in a reorganization of assets that was clearly designed to be completed before any divorce proceedings could designate those assets as marital property. I hadn't been read in. Neither of them had told me. What I understand now that I didn't fully understand in that moment, the financial reorganization wasn't the real wound. The real wound was the architecture of it, the patience, the coordination, the fact that while I was having coffee with Jessie on Wednesday mornings and telling her about Connor's emotional distance, she already knew exactly what that distance was for. Every sympathetic nod. Every "he's been under a lot of pressure." Every cup of coffee held in both hands. I photographed every page of the folder with my phone. I replaced the rubber band. I put the folder back. Then I called Richard. He referred me immediately to a colleague named Patricia Oakes, a family law attorney in Columbus with 20 years of experience in contested asset cases. I drove to Columbus the following morning and spent 3 hours in her office. I laid out everything: the folder, the charges on the account, the Merritt and Associates billing, the apartment search Nolan had seen. Patricia listened without interrupting, made notes in a yellow legal pad that struck me as bitterly ironic, and then told me what I needed to know. The transfers were real. The LLC was legally registered. But Ohio marital property law had specific provisions about asset reorganization during an ongoing marriage, particularly when such reorganization appeared designed to reduce a spouse's entitlement in future proceedings. If we could demonstrate a pattern of intent, she said, the transfers could be challenged. She also told me something I hadn't expected. The divorce filing I was likely anticipating, the one Connor was apparently planning, would require both our signatures, or a legal process of service. If someone attempted to present me with already signed documents, I should know that in Ohio, divorce petitions are filed by one party and served to the other. A document bearing both signatures, pre-signed, outside of formal legal process, would be legally irregular at best. I drove home through the December dark and thought about that. I didn't confront Connor. I didn't call Jessie. I came home and made dinner and helped Nolan with a history project and watched television for an hour and went to bed, and I lay in the dark beside my husband and I was more alone than I had ever been in my life, and also, underneath that, something else was growing. Something that didn't feel like grief. It felt like clarity. The thought arrived slowly, the way important things often do. I hadn't been living inside a marriage that was falling apart. I had been living inside a plan. Someone had decided, at some point, the outcome of my life, and had spent months quietly engineering the conditions for it. And I had been so busy being the person who kept everything running, who made the dinners and paid the bills and had the Wednesday coffees, that I had handed them exactly the time they needed. I sat across from those divorce papers for what felt like a very long time. The candles had burned down another 1/4 inch. Nolan had gone very still. Connor had set down his fork. Diane's hand was flat on the table, as if she was studying something. I looked at the signature again. Connor James Halloran, in precise forward-leaning script. Where did this come from? I asked. My voice was level. I was surprised by how level it was. Patrick prepared it, Diane said. Patrick was the family's estate and property attorney, the same man who had overseen the asset transfers, I now knew. Connors had a difficult time initiating this conversation, so I thought. I didn't ask you to do this, Mom. Connor's voice was quiet. He still wasn't looking at me. Something crossed Diane's face, not regret, not surprise. Something more like the mild irritation of a person who has managed a situation and found it inconveniently unmanaging itself. The signature on this document, I said, is not Connor's. Silence. I've been looking at Connor's handwriting for 12 years. The capital C loops counterclockwise. This one loop forward. The T crossing in Halloran, Connor's goes left to right with a slight upward angle. This one is flat. I set the document down and looked at Diane. Who signed this? Connor looked at the paper. Genuinely looked. And I watched something shift in his face, not guilt, not yet, but something more complicated. Confusion. And underneath the confusion, the first hairline crack of something that might have been alarm. I signed it, Diane said, calmly. Connor was going to sign it when he was ready, but the filing window with Patrick's office. You forged your son's signature on a legal document. I acted in his best interest. He was hesitating. He was hesitating. I let that sit. Because it was his choice. Not yours. I turned to Connor. And this is the part of the story I have thought about most in the months since, the look on his face in that moment. Because it wasn't the look of a man whose plan had been exposed. It was the look of a man who was, for the first time, seeing the plan. Seeing it from where I was sitting. Connor, I said, quietly. Did you know about the LLC? A pause. What LLC? HFG Holdings. The transfer of the Ashford commercial properties. The 5% stake assigned to Jesse Elton. I watched his face. Your mother restructured the family assets to reduce the marital estate before any divorce filing. Jesse is a named stakeholder. They've been coordinating this for at least 8 months. He looked at his mother. Diane said nothing. For the first time in 12 years, she said nothing. The apartment search you did in October, I continued. Were you planning that on your own, or were you told it was the next step? Connor was very still. She said it was the only way to protect the properties. That if we divorced without transferring them, you'd be entitled to. I'm his wife, I said. Of course I'd be entitled. I thought. He stopped. His jaw tightened. I thought I understood what was happening. You thought she was protecting you, I said. She was protecting the assets. The distinction hit him somewhere visible. Nolan said, quietly, from across the table, is anyone going to tell me what's happening? I looked at my son. 12 years old, watching the architecture of his family be laid out like blueprints on a Christmas dinner table. Yes, I said. In a little while. I promise. What happened next, I will condense, not because it wasn't significant, but because the emotion of it is not the part that matters most in retrospect. Connor left the table. Diane tried, twice, to redirect the conversation toward what she called practical outcomes. I picked up the forged document, placed it back in the envelope, and told her I would be keeping it as evidence. She said, with a thin smile, of what? Document fraud, I said. And potentially conspiracy to conceal marital assets. My attorney in Columbus has all the transfer records. The thin smile went away. I am not a person who raises her voice. I didn't raise it that night. I said what needed to be said in the same temperature Diane had always used, and I watched it land in a way that her version of that temperature never had, because mine was based on facts and hers had always been based on the assumption that I wouldn't find any. Jesse called me that night at 10:15. I saw her name on the phone and I let it go to voicemail. I didn't listen to the message until the following week. The months between Christmas dinner and the resolution of everything were not clean or swift. I want to be honest about that, because stories like this sometimes get told as if exposure is the end, as if the confrontation is the last hard thing. It isn't. Patricia Oakes filed a formal challenge to the HFG Holdings asset transfers in January, citing evidence of coordinated concealment of marital property. The case took 4 months, 2 depositions, and one very uncomfortable afternoon in a Columbus courtroom. The forged divorce petition, the one Diane had signed with her son's name, became Exhibit A in a document fraud complaint filed separately by Connor, who had, in the 2 weeks between Christmas and the New Year, made a decision I had not anticipated. He retained his own attorney. Not Patrick, not anyone connected to his mother's legal world. His own. He called me on the 28th of December and said, carefully, "I need to tell you some things I didn't know I needed to tell you." I listened. It took almost 2 hours. Some of what he told me I had already found. Some of it I hadn't. The full shape of Diane's planning was larger than I had reached. She had been discussing the restructure with Patrick for nearly 2 years, had involved Jesse as a nominal stakeholder specifically because Jesse was known to me and could serve as a credible misdirect if the transfers were ever questioned, and had used Connor's growing unhappiness in the marriage, real unhappiness, he admitted, not manufactured, as the opening through which she had inserted her own design. "She told me you'd take everything," he said. "The properties, the business, the accounts. She said you'd been planning it." I said nothing. "I know," he said. "I know how that sounds." It sounded like a man who had been so accustomed to his mother's version of reality that he had mistaken it for his own. I had some sympathy for that. Less than I might have had a year earlier, but some. We did not reconcile. I want to be clear about that, not because it's the ending people expect, but because it's the honest one. 11 years doesn't dissolve into nothing just because betrayal is revealed. But it also doesn't reassemble into a marriage just because the manipulator is exposed. What Connor and I had was real in the way that damaged things are real, genuinely felt, genuinely broken, genuinely insufficient. We filed for divorce in March. The actual divorce, the legal one, with proper process, both our signatures, a settlement that reflected what the court determined I was entitled to under Ohio marital property law. Patricia was precise and relentless. The HFG transfers were partially unwound. I received a compensatory settlement equivalent to my share of the reorganized assets. It was not everything. It was enough. Diane did not face criminal charges for the document fraud, ultimately. Her attorney negotiated a civil resolution that Patrick's firm quietly absorbed. But the complaint was on record. The transfer scheme was on record. And in a city the size of Ashford Falls, where her family's reputation had always been part of her operating leverage, on record is its own kind of consequence. I watched, from a careful distance, as 2 of her commercial tenant contracts declined renewal. The third went to arbitration over lease disputes she hadn't anticipated. I don't call it justice. I call it gravity. Jesse's voicemail was 9 minutes long. An explanation, then a justification, then an apology, then a longer explanation. I played it once, beginning to end, sitting in my car outside a client meeting. Then I deleted it. I didn't block her number immediately, I waited until I felt nothing about it, which took approximately 6 weeks. Then I did. 9 years is a long time to think you know someone. What I've come to understand is that I did know her, I just knew a version she had assembled specifically for me, which is a different thing entirely. The grief of that is its own category. Not the grief of betrayal, exactly. The grief of having loved a construction. Nolan and I talked, carefully and honestly, across several weeks of dinners and car rides and the patient back and forth that good conversations with 12-year-olds require. He asked precise questions. He cried once, briefly, at something Connor said in a phone call, and I held him in the kitchen for a while without speaking. He is resilient in the way children are resilient when adults tell them the truth at the right volume. Connor sees him every other weekend. Their relationship is its own thing now, being rebuilt on different terms, and I stay out of it except where Nolan needs me to be in it. My firm took on 2 new projects in the spring: the renovation of the Ashford Falls Library branch on 2nd Street and a residential commission that came through a referral from the Callahan Hotel job. I hired a 3rd employee in April. I moved into a smaller house on the east side of the city, a 1940s bungalow with original hardwood floors and a back garden that gets good light in the afternoon. I have been slowly making it something. Some mornings I wake up in that house and the quiet is so complete that I have to remind myself the quiet is mine. That nobody is managing it. That the ordinary morning, coffee, light through the kitchen window, the sound of Nolan still asleep down the hall, is not the surface of something hidden. It is just the morning. That took longer to believe than I expected. It is the thing I am most glad I kept working toward. What this story ultimately reveals is not simply the anatomy of a betrayal, it reveals something more particular and more troubling: the way a family system can function as a machine, processing loyalty and love and legal trust into something that serves one person's design while everyone else believes they're simply living their lives. Diane is the obvious center of the scheme. But the more interesting question is what made the scheme possible at all, and the answer lives in the spaces between people who should have been talking to each other. Connor's relationship with his mother had been built, over decades, on a model of protection that ran only in one direction. She protected the assets, the legacy, the family name, and everyone in the family protected their access to her approval by not examining the cost too closely. He had learned, long before Mara arrived, to accept Diane's framing of reality as the correct one. His unhappiness in the marriage was real, but it was also useful, and at some point, the useful version of it became the only version he was allowed to hold. Mara's blind spot is more sympathetic and, perhaps because of that, more worth examining. She was fluent in the surface language of the household. She could read Diane's signals, Connor's moods, the particular weight of a silence at dinner. What she couldn't read was the thing she hadn't been shown, the financial architecture underneath. And she couldn't read it partly because she had decided, 11 years earlier at a moment of grief and pregnancy and vulnerability, that it wasn't her territory. One moment of deference, repeated over a decade, becomes a belief. She believed the financial world of the Halloran family was not hers to question. That belief was constructed for her, but she had maintained it herself. The accumulation is the real mechanism here. No single event in the story, not the first odd charge on the account, not Connor's emotional withdrawal, not even Jesse's strange familiarity with Diane, was sufficient on its own to break open the picture. Each one was explainable. Each one was absorbed. The picture only became visible when enough pieces had accumulated to make the pattern undeniable, and by then the scheme was nearly complete. Jesse's role represents the deepest structural deception in the story, and the most psychologically precise one. She wasn't recruited as an enemy. She was kept as a friend, a specific kind of friend who could serve as both intelligence source and emotional misdirect, someone whose presence in Mara's confidence was itself a piece of the design. The cruelty of it isn't that Jesse betrayed Mara. The cruelty is that Mara was never able to fully trust the version of support she had been receiving, because the support had been, from some point forward, conditional on Mara not looking too closely. What the story ultimately clarifies is the difference between proximity and safety. Mara lived close to everything, 3 blocks from her in-laws, 9 years deep in a friendship, 11 years into a marriage. She had access to all the surfaces. What she lacked, for most of those years, was the permission she had unknowingly given herself not to look deeper. When she finally did look, when she stopped accepting offered explanations and went to the second drawer of the filing cabinet, she found that the truth had been there the whole time, waiting for her to decide she was allowed to find it. What stays with me about this story, what I keep returning to, is the forged signature. Not as a legal detail. As an image. A mother so certain of her right to decide the shape of her son's life that she signed his name to a document ending his marriage, because he was hesitating. Because he hadn't yet done what she'd decided he would do. That hesitation was the most human thing in the story. It was Connor almost finding his way back to himself before someone else made the decision for him. I think many of us have people in our lives who mistake control for care. who have decided, quietly and without asking, that they know better what we need than we do. The dangerous thing about those people isn't that they're cruel, often they genuinely believe they're protecting us. The dangerous thing is how long we let them, because their certainty feels like safety. And by the time we understand the difference, the documents are already on the table.